Employers are really starting to hate Gen Z, but why? What is so bad? A recent survey of 1,000 managers in the US found that more than half cite frustration and almost to the point of stress in managing Gen Z. Almost a third of those surveyed said that they would ideally avoid hiring a Gen Z candidate, and 18% have contemplated leaving their own job because they think managing Gen Z is too much. What is it about Gen Z that is making employers incredibly frustrated with them as a whole? Well, it's a few reasons. Well, the first is that this always happens. I mean, every generation faces the same lazy and entitled label until they become an elder generation. There's no doubt in my mind there's a massive component of that in this. Baby boomers were dubbed the me generation in the 1970s, and critics said that they were self-absorbed, they were pleasure-seeking, and unwilling to conform to traditional work norms. Despite being raised by the so-called self-sacrificing greatest generation, boomers were seen as rejecting discipline in favor of personal fulfillment. Gen X were the original slackers, branded cynical, aimless, and disloyal. They came of age during economic uncertainty and rising divorce rates. Media in the 90s labeled them as apathetic, unmotivated, too skeptical to care, too jaded to try. Millennials, same thing. Time magazine, for example, did an iconic 2013 cover calling them narcissistic and entitled. They were accused of craving praise, avoiding hard work, and killing traditional industries with their demand for flexibility and purpose. And is that too dissimilar from Gen Z? Because this is where we're at now, and they seem to be the most difficult generation to manage. Surveys show that hiring managers consider them entitled, soft, unprepared, quick to ask for more, slow to adapt to workplace norms. Terms like quiet quitting and lazy girl jobs have fueled the backlash, and that is why I'm making this video today. The pattern repeats. The reality is that what each generation calls entitlement was often just the next generation adapting to a new economy, new technologies, and different values, but the script stays the same. They're lazy, and we don't like them. And this will honestly never stop. Every generation has different tech, different stimulus, different ways of adapting to the world around it because we're growing up in different worlds. And so as long as there's technological progress, there's social progress, and the advancement of humans, each and every new generation will just seem completely foreign to the generations that came before it, even though they're not really that dissimilar. A big reason why work ethic seems to be at the core of this generational divide that keeps showing itself is that in earlier generations, there wasn't a follow your passion narrative that there kind of is now. It was about showing up, doing what you were told, no matter how terrible that might be, and earning your place over time, often without feedback or mentorship or flexibility. It's just like, this is the way it's done, do it. From their lens, watching a 24-year-old come straight out of school and demand remote work, mental health stipends, and purpose-driven projects, to them, it just sounds ridiculous. And if you understand that, well, it makes it a little bit easier to deal with. So if every generation gets this kind of heat, why does it feel extra hot on Gen Z? The second reason is amplification. In previous decades, criticism of the youngest up-and-coming generation was always reserved for, some media spots, water cooler conversation, your uncle, your neighbor, whatever. They were sort of isolated one-off events. It was sort of like an understanding that, the young people are so lazy or whatever. But it wasn't like in your face as much. Now you have countless videos and memes and social media content online that amplify the difference between generations. And honestly, those kinds of videos and pieces of content do really well because people relate to one thing or another. You either think the next gen is lazy and silly, or you think the older gen is way out of touch, crusty, whatever, right? You align yourself with one and you poke fun at the other. And another facet to that is people want to know why previous generations or, newer generations see them so differently than they see themselves. A great example of that right now is the Gen Z stare trend. And this is something that's getting so much traction online, and essentially what it is, it's a neutral, expressionless look in social or work settings. Experts link it to the events of 2020, perhaps, maybe screen-based communication and shifting norms. But in my opinion, it seems like Gen Z is just having a really tough time hiding how dumb they think someone sounds, or how annoyed they think someone sounds, or confused they are, or whatever it is, right? And why is that? Why are they just so out in the open with what they're thinking visually? From an older perspective, it just reads as disrespect when you just blankly stare at somebody. It's like, don't do that, right? Many grew up in workplaces where eye contact, facial expressions, and verbal confirmation were expected and honestly sometimes demanded. And if a younger employee doesn't mirror that, or worse, they just stare at them blankly like they're insane, it's taken as a challenge or a lack of effort. Whether that's fair or not, it certainly makes the relationship a lot different. The third reason, and honestly, this might be one thing that boomers have right, is that Gen Z is just not that great at communication. Or is that total nonsense? Gen Z's communication style is one of the most misunderstood aspects in today's workplace. And the truth is, honestly, it's a lot more nuanced than they're just bad at talking or they can't hold a conversation. This will surprise literally nobody, but Gen Z, believe it or not, really excels in digital communication and is by far the most adept generation at communicating online. It's not even close. A Canadian survey found that 57% say remote work actually improved their writing skills, far outpacing boomers, and they're fluent in visual platforms and short-form messaging, multi-channel conversations. I mean, they are whizzes with communication on the digital front. They also place a high value on empathy and emotional intelligence, with many actively seeking to build soft skills, according to Deloitte. But face-to-face communication is where the gap becomes factually visible, and that's where employers are honestly having the toughest time with Gen Z. A Forbes survey found that 24% of Gen Z respondents said their verbal skills have worsened due to remote learning and working, compared to just 5% of boomers. In the office, this shows up in subtle but jarring ways. One example, again, is the Gen Z stare. I mean, it is a real thing. It's been interpreted by older coworkers as maybe rude, disengaged, passive-aggressive. It's less about attitude and more about the unfamiliarity with non-verbal workplace norms that weren't maybe learned in Zoom classrooms or something like that. I mean, it really is sort of a weirdness that boomers and older generations seem to feel. And, I don't think they're totally off base. And it's not a stretch to say that some Gen Zs are certainly not as great communicators in person as generations of the past. The thing is, the corporate of old was expected to speak up in meetings, to make phone calls, to project, to be great presenters. That is how a lot of business is done, is being front-facing, confident, all those kinds of things. They had no choice but to develop these muscles if they wanted to move up the corporate ladder. So perhaps when they see a younger coworker send a Slack message to somebody that's a 10-second walk away or on the other side of the building where they could just go have a quick conversation and they'd rather avoid that confrontation or that chat, it does seem a little foreign to them. The less you use something, the less it gets developed. And honestly, the foundational years of 2020, 21, and 22 are showing that some of Gen Z's skills have atrophied when they should have been developing the most. The fourth reason why employers are struggling is honestly, Gen Z just doesn't really put up with a lot of stuff. They have a much higher standard for their employers, and they are significantly less tolerant of perceived injustices against them or to those around them. In sum, they don't put up with the same BS that previous generations had to stomach. And they're not afraid to walk away from something if the expectations are not met. In fact, another Deloitte study found that the vast majority of Gen Z respondents said they would reject a job if the employer's values did not align with their own. And honestly, this is not just talk. I mean, this generation has led unionization efforts at companies like Amazon and Starbucks and Google, pushing them for better pay, safety, and flexibility. Have they been very successful at that? Maybe not, but they're not afraid to challenge the system, even if it costs them job security. They're driving changes in what workers expect from their employers and what they'll no longer tolerate. This is also a generation that's hyper aware of injustice, and being raised on social media, they've seen a lot of nasty stuff. They're more likely to call out discrimination, inequality, mental health stigma loudly and publicly. That's going to make some employers uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Older generations were often taught that you earn your voice over time. They see it as disrespect when a 22-year-old pushes back on day 3. Not every job is toxic. Not every boss is abusive. Sometimes Gen Z might mistake hard work for unfair treatment, and that can make it harder for older managers to coach and invest in them. The last big divide is remote work. Based on literally everything we've talked about in this video, and for obvious convenience reasons, Gen Z would strongly prefer to work remotely because they are much more well-suited and skilled to do so on average. But there's a caveat. While older generations had to adapt to digital tools, Gen Z came of age on them. So it makes sense that they're the ones pushing hardest for flexibility. Many say that they'd walk away from a job if it didn't offer at least some remote option, and it's hard not to see why. But here's where it gets misunderstood. A lot of them don't want to work fully remote. In fact, the majority prefer a hybrid setup that combines the focus of working from home with the connection and mentorship that happens in person. They're not trying to avoid the office entirely, they just want to use it more intentionally and for a purpose. It is very difficult for some employers to wrap their heads around this, but yes, a lot of Gen Z folks actually do enjoy coming into the office every now and again to get out of the house and switch up their routine. It's when they have to commute 2 to 3 hours a day, every single day, where it becomes a lot more annoying. And from the older gen angle, like, I get it. We did it for 40 years. What makes you so special? To them, remote work still feels like a perk, something that is given, not granted. And when they hear younger workers complain about going into the office every day during the week, it genuinely feels like entitlement. In my opinion, honestly, this whole thing can be boiled down to collaboration, right? There's brilliant, wonderful people in every generation. I mean, that's an obvious thing. But I think so many of these people that complain on both sides, like people complaining about boomers, people complaining about Gen Z, just are non-empathetic to how things were for the older gens or the younger gens, right? Like, it's just two completely different worlds. And so if you can understand that Gen Z has developed a much different skill set, but a really, really advanced and modern skill set that can leverage and help you grow your company to God knows how big, well, then leverage that. And if you're a younger folk trying to find your way in the corporate ladder and trying to advance your career, understand that some of those more traditional, maybe more archaic things, maybe things that you think are silly, matter to them, and trade off on that. And if you can make those trade-offs and work collaboratively, all generations involved in the company are going to benefit tremendously.